Hey guys, this is Miss Figueroa here. I will be talking about type 1 and type 2 error and different examples of the two, okay? Um, a type 1 error is a false positive. It's the equivalent of, let's say, a male goes to a doctor, and then the doctor tells this young man, "You're pregnant." Obviously, that's impossible for a male to be pregnant, so this is a false positive. This doctor is giving him a positive pregnancy test, which is false. And then a type 2 error would be a false negative. Like if a pregnant woman goes to the doctor and then this doctor says, "You're not pregnant, you just ate a watermelon." This is a false negative because this doctor is telling this woman she's not pregnant. She's giving her a negative pregnancy test when in fact she really is pregnant. So that's a false negative is a type 2 error. A false positive is a type 1 error. So a type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis. Main thing you need to know is type 1 error is when you reject the null when the null really is true. Okay? But the null is true. So when you reject the null hypothesis, when you reject, you end up accepting the alternative. So you're accepting the alternative, you're producing a positive result, but it's a false result because you're accepting something that was wrong. So that's a false positive. So you reject the null, you end up accepting the alternative, which is a false positive. Okay, so type 1, you reject the null when the null really is true. A type 2 error. A type 2 error means you fail to reject the null when the null really is false. Okay. But if you think about your hypothesis test, if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, that means you end up rejecting the alternative because you failed to provide enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, you end up rejecting the alternative. You can't accept it because you didn't provide enough evidence. So you're rejecting the alternative, which produces a negative if you're rejecting the alternative, but it's a false negative because the null really was false. So you should have accepted the alternative, okay? So a way to remember is type 2 is when you fail to reject the null, okay? So type 2, you fail to reject. Type 1, you reject the null hypothesis. So if we look at an example, in each of these scenarios, I need you to identify what type of error is made. So if we look at this example, it says a test of the null p equals 0.8 versus the alternative is p less than 0.8 rejects the null hypothesis. Meaning it says, oh, the null hypothesis is false. So then I can accept the alternative hypothesis, okay? Then it's later discovered that p is 0.9. But if I plug in 0.9, that's not less than 0.8. So then I made an error. What type of error did I make? Well, I rejected the null when I should have failed to reject the null. So then we would say this is a type 1 error because we rejected the null and we ended up accepting the alternative. So this is a false positive. This is a type 1 error, okay? But the key word here is you rejected the null when in fact you should have failed to reject the null. Our next example, we have a test of the null hypothesis p is equal to 0.7 versus the alternative, we said p was less than 0.7. And then after you do your hypothesis test, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. So if we failed to reject, that means your p-value was not less than the alpha level. So you did not provide enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis, so you failed to reject it, and because you failed to reject it, you end up rejecting the alternative. But then you realize later that p is 0.6. 0.6 is less than 0.7, so we made a mistake. What type of mistake was it? We failed to reject, so this tells you this is a type 2 error. I apologize, my software always does that. So this is a type 2 error because we failed to reject the null hypothesis. I'm going to go back to the previous one. So this type 1 error, I forgot to mention, if you reject the null, that means your p-value was less than the alpha level. And so if your p-value is less than the alpha level, then you reject the null hypothesis and you accept the alternative, which ended up being, the alternative ended up being false. So that was a type 1 error. You fail to reject if your p-value is not less than the alpha level. But because we failed to reject, that's a type 2 error. All right, so in each of the following, I want you now to identify the type of error that was made and the consequence of each of these errors, okay? So consequences, we're looking at real life situations. What consequences are there in real life? So a bank wants to see if the enrollment on their website is above 30%. Okay, so their enrollment, they are wanting it to be above 30% based on a small sample of customers. So in this sample, it tested the null hypothesis was p equals 0.3 versus the alternative is greater than 0.3 because they're checking to see if it's above. After they did their whole hypothesis test, they reject the null hypothesis. So if they rejected the null hypothesis, that means their p-value was less than the alpha level, and they rejected the null hypothesis, and they ended up accepting the alternative. So they accepted the fact that, yes, in fact, their enrollment was above 30%. But then later, the bank find out that actually 28% of all customers enrolled. Okay, so this actually happened. 28% of all customers enrolled, which is less than the 30% that they were interested in. Okay, so they rejected the null and they accepted the alternative when they should have failed to reject the null. And so because they rejected the null hypothesis, that means this is a type 1 error. Okay, and if you think about this, is the enrollment on the website. And so if they are going to spend money on a website, thinking, oh, our enrollment is going to be high on our website, but it ends up not being so high. So the consequences in real life, because remember, you have to talk about the consequences. So the consequence in real life, consequences could be an example. The bank would spend a lot of money to enhance their website when not that many people are actually using the website. So it ends up being a waste of resources, okay? So this is a waste of resource or money, if you think about it like that, okay? In real life, the consequences pretty much are like you're wasting money or not, okay? So the consequences in this specific example would be they're going to invest in this whole website. They're going to invest all this money, but then they later find out that only 28% of the customers actually enrolled. So they spend all this money for nothing, basically. Well, I guess I shouldn't say for money. I mean, for nothing. Those 28% people, I guess, would be useful, but it's not as cost effective as they thought it would be. All right, next example. It says a pharmaceutical company tests whether a drug lifts the headache relief from 25% achieved by the placebo. So right now they have a placebo, and that placebo can lift headache relief at 25%. Okay, so 25% is the placebo. And then they do a hypothesis test, and the hypothesis test fails to reject the null hypothesis because the p-value is 0.465, which is not less than an alpha level. And it doesn't tell you what the alpha level, but the p-value, you can see 0.465 is definitely not less than the alpha level. Not less than the alpha level. So then they end up failing to reject, and they reject the alternative hypothesis, which we don't know what it is, but the fact that they failed to reject the null, they could not accept the alternative. So further testing shows that the drug actually relieves headaches in 38% of people. So this fails to reject tells you that this is a type 2 error because they failed to reject the null hypothesis, which they should have rejected the null hypothesis, so they could have accepted the alternative. And it turns out that this actual drug did relieve headaches in 38% of people. And so the consequences of real life, if you think about, this medicine that relieves better than the placebo did. So this company, the pharmaceutical company, is losing out on making money for this drug that could potentially help people. So the pharmaceutical company is losing out on all this money that they could make on this drug that is actually more beneficial than the placebo would be. And then also, if you think about, people are losing out on this better drug that can lift their headaches relief. Okay, so the pharmaceutical company is losing out on making money, but people are also losing out on this pill that could help people with their headache relief. And so the consequences in real life, you have to kind of just think about it like money-wise versus like the benefits that people could be losing out on. Okay, but that's kind of the basics of type 1 and type 2 error. I know it gets confusing with the whole like fail to reject, rejecting, accepting the alternative and all that stuff, but just remember that a type 2 error is you fail to reject, and a type 1 error is you reject the null when you really should have failed to reject it. Okay, I hope that helps, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me.